before, if and we get around to analyzing the specific news items of the night, let's try one more time about whatever it is, to use terms like you have to make a distinction if you're going to talk about anything, all the way from being able to make $1 million in real estate while not knowing nothing, that kind of thing. You have to draw a distinction if this was some sort of one of those information programs and I could pass off as an ordinary person and go, well, here's a way to make $1 million within 3 weeks while not knowing nothing, which many people would immediately lock on that channel. No matter what you talk about, if it's going to be even superfluously, speciously, spuriously, apparently informative, there has to be a distinction or the person will not listen. The distinction being, if you listen to me, then you can make $1 million in 2 weeks in real estate while not knowing nothing. But turn me off and fat chance. No. Well, it's the same reason people go to Harvard. Because they say, come here and you'll do better. So we've been calling such things as a thinker, a real thinker. The thing is, it is meaningless once you understand it, which some of you do, and I was going to go ahead and try and point out just a bubbling example that covers almost the history of man. The thing about whatever a real thinker's world would be, if there's any one thing you could say, it would be intellectually a world of non-mutual exclusivity, which you cannot say about anything else. Contraire. Really? Yes. We're talking about serious contraire. Because if you're operating at the ordinary intellectual level, what we've been also referring to as partisan, you're operating by the normal flows of electrochemical energy that runs the brain in everyone, then you have to be dealing with mutual exclusivity. For you to say, well, it's my belief that the most civilized, reasonable, beneficial approach to the affairs of man's political body would be under the general umbrella of republicanism. Now you're saying that on the basis that anything that does not fit that is not as good. So you cannot, the ordinary brain, it of course doesn't have to be politics or economic models or religion, anything that the human mind says. If you go up to a human mind and say, aren't you Lorenzo Swartz? And the guy goes, yes. As you all know, you don't even have to have passed 10th grade logic. Does that mean, yes, I am Lorenzo Swartz, at least the one he has in mind, Lorenzo X Swartz, as opposed to every other possibility? The human mind deals in what ends up, it is a quite real, quite physical basis of electrochemical activity, but it would even appear to have a certain kind of philosophical, psychological, verbal basis, that is, that the world of the mind ordinarily has to be on the basis of mutual exclusivity. Or you can't say, if somebody says, do you believe in God? And you go, no. For it to make any sense, do you believe in free elections? Yes. Whatever you say, I know you can get around and play with it a little bit, but when it comes down to the kinds of decisions that seem to run the world collectively and would seem to run an ordinary man's world individually, it is on the basis, eventually, ultimately, and this is a continual process, of there being some kind of mutual exclusivity in a decision. Are you going to cheat on your taxes this year, or just you're going ahead and pay them and it's not worth the risk? Yes, go ahead. Actually, file it. You have to make a decision, and it is mutually exclusive to the alternative. A real thinker's world is not one of mutual exclusivity. That, if we were dealing on the basis still of mutual exclusivity, that in itself would make no sense. Because then you'd say, well, wait a minute, as opposed to, and it goes on, and all you're doing is trying to fit, which is the evolution of civilized ordinary thought. It is simply the continual adding on of new horses on the same old merry-go-round. It seems like there's been some sort of progress. So I was going to show you there's a kind of overlapping. There were some news items tonight that had to do with where the simple meets the complex. And of course, I know somebody's going to say where the gold of the blue of the night meets the gold of the day, and you got to remember that, thank God, Bing Crosby is dead, and we don't have to go into that. But it's where the simple, where the universal seems to meet the local, where the complex seems to meet the simple, It's where the lightning meets the goo, and it's where Mary and the Lamb go. They look at each other and go, wondering how much men are going to. Here, I was going to give you an example. The point of all that was there is a kind of meshing, there is a kind of overlapping that is not spatial, it is not temporal, there is no description of it. As I sometimes try and get you to see the fact that may seem to be a very crude analogy, but the fact is, if we're staying right now, let's assume that this program is going on like it is, that we're in Oklahoma City, and let's assume that right now it is 5 in the afternoon, of course, which it is, but you do understand that right now, in Fort Lee, New Jersey, if it's 5 here, then it's what? It's 2 o'clock there, right? Somewhere in that neighborhood, and it's 2 o'clock real time to them. It's not 2 o'clock, we somewhere, whatever it is. That the time zones, although this is a spatial matter in a three-dimensional world, that it seems to be quite distinct, and you can, of course, explain away or explain how it is because of the movement of the heavenly bodies, that when it's X time in one place, it's X hours later or earlier in another place, and yet it's simultaneous. That if it is 8 o'clock in Fort Lee, New Jersey, and it is 5 o'clock in Oklahoma City, there's nothing strange about it. That's just the way it is. But the world of the real thinker, this kind of non-mutual exclusivity is even more fun than that. An example. It has been beat around, and so I'm going to use it rather than make up one. There have been all sorts of philosophical, sociological uses of this about how man has progressed. At the historical level, what they're talking about is collectively, but here it goes. It is said, for instance, that up until the time of Copernicus, that man believed that he was the center of the universe. But then it came along, and of course it was a process, I can describe it for a few pages, of the development of the technology and whatever the Dutchman was with grinding lenses. But finally Copernicus gets to the point of having the right kind of telescope, right kind of technology, and he decides, he sees without any doubt, although he was scoffed at for a while and etc., we know, but historically, collectively, intellectually speaking, up until the time, this is what they say now, and all of you surely read some version of this and you nod along, it's accepted history, that after Copernicus, man could no longer believe that he was the center of the universe, that he just simply could not, and it changed everything. Now, besides a few real backward people that still took the Bible as being literal or the Koran, but the point is, at least in the Western world history, it is an accepted truth that the truth, there's a truth of Copernicus, post-Copernicus, that man could no longer see himself as the center of the universe. It changed him forever. Don't make me go through it. I'm just trying to do the kind of, you've all read that, and it's just, it sounds correct. That you just put yourself back in the position there 500, 600 years ago, thinking about that you're finally faced, and that you're a reasonable person, or you're thinking back to a archetypical reasonable person of that time, and he's faced with the fact. Copernicus has these observations. He's made drawings. He'll let you come look through his telescope, and he simply pointed out, it's not a hasty decision. He has been working on that, I forget now, decades. And he now has it all, and he can show you. He even has some of the math down about the movements of some of the more visible sister planets here. But it shows that man, it might be nice myths about the Bible and Adam and Eve and all that, but the earth is not the center of the universe. It's not even the center of our solar system. Look what a shock that was to man psychologically. It just changed everything. Okay. Sounds right? Everybody's gone along with that? Except for this. May I ask you this? Do you really think, for what you know now, that there were not a few men on this planet 500 years ago, 5,000 years ago, but how about 500 years ago? Are you going to, you really think that there weren't a few people around that had already thought about it? Forget technology. They don't need technology once you can think. That there were already men long before that that looked around in a sense and thought about it, and they knew damn well man wasn't the center of anything. They didn't have to wait for some guy with a funny name like Copernicus. They didn't have to wait for somebody to say, hey, look through here. You know, because hell, it could have been one of those things, just turn your eye black. A real thinker, you really think that? And of course, supposedly, or hopefully, your laughter points out that you know damn well that there were men long before that, that knew that man was not the center of the universe. And I'm not going to explain how, because I can't. You either understand or you don't. You mean it took, at least in recorded history, the Western world, it took 3,000 or 4,000 years, and it took one man in the progress of technology to the point that somebody stared for decades up the heavens, drawn, and finally announced to people that it's my conclusion that this planet is not the center of the universe, of reality. What? And of course, if that be true, then the people running this planet, the ones that seem to be running it, the big timers, man, then that means, wait a minute, don't say that. Yes, I'm sorry. That means that we're not the center of the universe. And I'm back quoting now, accepted history. Deep philosophical history. Not just history, this gets into philosophical history. That after that, man was never the same. He could no longer, not any educated man, could no longer walk around thinking, well, the gods and the universe is circling around man. They're also, you're nuts. Hadn't you heard about Copernicus? Hadn't you realized the Earth, this planet, is not even the center of what's going on? You don't say. What a shock. Back to my question. You really think now what you know, that there were not men long, I'm talking about long. Did you say long? Yes. I'm talking about a long time before Copernicus. I'm talking about seriously long. That just, one more time, I'm not going to describe how. You don't need a telescope if you can think. Technology is not it. That they simply, I was calling it look around. Okay? They simply looked around and they kind of, I'll say figured out. How about that? They simply kind of looked around and kind of figured out long time before Copernicus that we're not the center of anything. And you don't, when I say look around, you know where a thinker looks. If you can't think about it in here, you can forget all the telescopes in the world. You can forget all the technologies, find a hobby, and as much as we all take advantage of it. But do you understand that here is the kind of overlapping that's not spatial, it's not temporal, it's something else. That the truth of Copernicus was then the new collective truth. But it was nothing new to anyone who could think, to any individual. But what an individual here and there may know that we've been calling a real thinker, whatever the hell that is. It is somebody who understands something that is not dependent upon the collective. It's not that the collective was wrong, you understand. Copernicus, let's say, was right. We're not here to try and argue to what degree he was correct in his calculation, etc. Let's just assume that not only historical, but that philosophical slice, historical reality, that man was never the same after Copernicus. Let's accept that. But that collective truth is not belied by the fact that an individual here and there, a few people, a long time before that, already knew it. And you know that's true. And yet nobody, at the collective level, you have never read that. You have never even, nobody's ever pointed that out. They're not supposed to, but talk about the obvious. That it says man was never the same. There it is, you read in a book or you go to some lecture at a university and somebody giving the philosophical evolution of Western man, intellectually speaking, or something like that. And he starts dividing life up into, pre-Copernicus, post-Copernicus, pre-Darwin, post-Darwin. He starts showing how man goes through his evolutions, these shocks come in. But the first one normally that they do in the Western world is that man was no longer, it was just proven that man was not the center of the universe. It only took, by recorded history, a couple of thousand years. And back to what I'm saying. You know damn well that there were people around. And you know it personally, but you realize you can't prove it. But you understand, if you tried to point that no one else had pointed it out, and if you took the speaker that just made this statement, was start about, well, first, let's get to this. And he may give a little background about the pre-Copernicus days. how man thought himself the center of the universe, and how his myths reflected it, how his religious beliefs supported it, and et cetera, and et cetera. And then the slow, gradual march of technology, and men becoming more scientifically bent. And then it gets to Copernicus. And then he points out, after all of his studies and after all of his math and all of his observations, he proved to the world, well, all people who could be educated at the time, he showed them that man was not the center of the universe, and after that, man was never the same. And if you took the person, you understand, and we tried to say, you really think, sir, now you just said that, and you got a good round of applause, and you even have a reputation, but do you really think that there were not a few just strange men wandering around? I don't mean weird, but just a few people here and there that you never heard of. You don't think that somebody, even without a telescope, that there wasn't a man somewhere that had already, when he heard people talking about man, the center of the universe and all that, that there was just a guy here and there, a bricklayer, a drywall man, Socrates' second cousin, that went, that's a crock. And he just knew it. But he had nothing to say. He's not going to write about it. He can't prove it. And of course, you can think you know all that, and so you're not going around and broadcast it. But you might get this ordinary person go, well, that's got to be true. And it's gone like that. Why? Because it's of no consequence. It doesn't make the other untrue. If the man said, well, the speaker, if he said, well, you've got to be correct, now that you put it that way, just because he said that, that's not going to ruin his career, because he didn't have to go out there to the public and say, wait a minute, sir, before you people leave, wait a minute, I want to be truthful. This guy just pointed out to me, this guy just came back and he said, don't you realize that there had to be a few people somewhere that already knew that? And he says, I've got to tell you people, on the basis of intellectual, academic honesty, that's true. My whole life's been ruined. Does anyone have a pistol so I can take the honorable way out? It doesn't make it untrue. But just notice, they coexist, in the latter part, the real thinker's world, is never noted, because it is a different world. But it's not mutually, it is non-mutually exclusive. It doesn't make the observation that prior to Copernicus, men believe themselves the center of the universe. That is collectively true. Or they say it is, let's just accept it. That is collectively true. When you know for a damn fact. All you got to do is just be pointed out. Just somebody say, you really think there weren't a few men somewhere on this planet, quite sane, quite ordinary, that you never heard of, that long before that, whenever they heard somebody talking about, well, man's the center of the universe, they had no telescope, never even heard of it, and they would just look off, and they knew, well, that's not true. That they had a better idea of man's relative position, and the only technology they had was their brain, that they were thinking in a nonpartisan, non-mutually exclusive way. And yet it's never noted. Because at the collective level, it's not that it's not valid, it's impertinent. The herds have got to believe what they believe. They can't listen to strays. The herd is the collective intelligence of man at any particular time, and if there it is, these great herds of cows, making steady progress, developing telescopes, coming up with the idea of, if we could ever figure out how to upholster a couch right, we could discover psychoanalysis. They're plodding right along, and there's some kind of little stray heifer, some kind of little young steer running around the edges of the herd, and if it every now and then goes, you guys really think you're the center of the universe? I mean, it took you 3,000 years, and you had to come up with something to look through, and some guy, some intellectual hero, some guy with a funny name, had to say, no, that's not true, and then all of you went, let me study those drawings, and you discussed it for a while, and finally some of you came to the conclusion, by God, he could be correct. What do we do? Our whole life has changed. The history of cattle henceforth will take a different direction. And sometime before that, with some stray wandering around the periphery of the herd, which it wouldn't do, but if it did, and said, do you guys believe that? Would you just stop and think about it for a minute? Cows can't stop. Herds can't stop. They got to keep moving. And they got to stay up real close to what they're thinking about. And it all kind of just runs together, and it's hard to distinguish what's going on. Because what's going on is not an individual goings on. It's a collective goings on. as long as I start using examples, we can jump from the historical and scientific, or that kind of scientific. There's another one. It just pops up all the time. It's now tied into ecology and health and everything else, but it's always been around. It's a slightly different take on the same thing. That it's not that what I was about to quote more or less kinds of contemporaneous medical, well, we'll call it medical, you'll see what it is. I'm thinking about, you know what a hot hobby, growing hobby that health is. It keeps popping up all the time that they will, some team, somebody from some UN health organization or the University of Stockholm, somebody will, investigating the obvious dire effects of high levels of cholesterol and fat in the blood, the heart attacks and ingrown toenails or whatever the hell it is. And then somebody will suddenly come up with this. They'll find some group of people, like some group of Eskimos or some group of people up in the Reindeer Islands, Laplanders. We'll find out that they're eating unbelievable amounts of fat, just raw whale fat. They just chew it instead of candy bars. And their incident, they've done enough checking now, their incident of heart attacks is like 30% of people 200 miles away in Norway. But then they investigate. On top of that, they consume large amounts of raw fish, not whale meat, not the fat, but that contains fish oil, I think they call it. And they have now decided that in some way the fish oil helps dilute the blood, literally, that it helps counteract the high amounts of fat that the whale blubber is putting in them. There was maybe I should know, I bet some of you have seen it, them worrying about the French. That's even better. I know about how they smoke and drink, how they smoke and eat all the rich foods, and they've got even less heart problems than these Laplanders I just made up. And now the first guess was it had something to do with wine. Now, then a whole lot of places that bubbled up. Well, some of you must know the last year or so, and it kept bubbling up like we should investigate this, and it was like part of life. So next thing you know, people be encouraging each other to drink. Well, I could have used that, been the same thing, but listen, there's a point to this, and it is very, I guess for you I can say subtle. It's just because, it's not because they're wrong, and I'm about to tell you something that's correct. It is the merging that's so subtle that you got to listen. In other words, here it is. Let's just take and that's more or less, I know I've heard something like that. That this group somewhere is eating horrendous, according to contemporary, whoever was studying it. Let's say some American, I was just making up University Hall. Just some group of American scientists studied these Laplanders, and they're eating unbelievable amounts of fat, just raw blubber, whale blubber, which should be killing them. And they, in fact, have 40% less of heart problems than Americans. And then they attribute this high consumption of fish oil in their diet that they have now decided in some way it waters down the cholesterol or thins the blood, does something, and is counteracting it. And so now they're on the verge, there's already some suggestion that we should be, here in America, consuming more fish oil. All right. Now, I'm not making fun of any of this, but you understand this is a continuing hobby. What is the one thing that they never, and they can't? What is the one thing that you never hear that they ever take into consideration? That the only reason, let's assume that they're correct, that the only reason the fish oil works is because it's tied to the high consumption of blubber. That just because if we started now, us not eating too much raw fat, if we start drinking fish oil, it will not have the effect. And in fact, there is statistical evidence for that, and yet they can't see it. And that's why I say it's a hobby and a fad, because no, if that is suddenly, and it may be more popular even than I'm relating, that now it may be, I bet it is, some suggestion somewhere, or probably a book out, fish oil, secret to longevity. And the point is, it's not. I don't care if it is, but you understand on the basis of what I'm describing, their own investigations, it is not. And it'll be popular for 6 months, and then you won't hear about it. But notice what they don't see. I mean, it sounds like that one thing suddenly they start investigating, and then suddenly discovered, and it's the same thing, if you can follow this, as Copernicus discovering, wait a minute, our planet's not the center of reality, or of this universe. They discover there are people eating enough whale blubber to kill a decent person. And they almost have they got 40% less heart problems. And then they narrow it down. They do the testing. It's, science is a hobby like anything else, no offense to it. And they get down to the point that, this is helping counteract that. So, if we, who do not eat all that blubber, think about how much better off we'd even be than them if we start drinking this fish oil, consuming it. But notice, and you don't have to be a scientist, just on the surface, if you told a scientist that, or somebody just an educated, ordinary reader of that kind of literature, and you said, you know what, I heard a guy point out that the reason that kind of thing never works is they don't take into consideration the possibility. How about this? Sneak up. The possibility that the consumption of fish oil counteracts the blubber only because they eat the blubber. So if you don't eat the blubber and then you drink the fish oil, nothing. Try that. Don't worry about somebody else. Try that on your own ordinary, educated, scientific mind, and you go, what? And it's almost beyond the realm of mutual exclusivity. It's almost into the realm of insanity. Then you go, nah. I hear the words, the sentence almost makes sense, but that is insane. Well, how come men never come to conclusions? Well, besides the fact that it's suicidal, why does not all forms of scientific, psychological, religious, philosophical investigation ever come to any conclusion? Or, put another way as tonight, why did man invent punctuation? Because he didn't know when to stop. And why was that? Because he can't stop. That's one of the reasons you have awards. That's one of the reasons you have degrees. That's one of the reasons that you have committees that they all decide, well, have we decided that it is, what amount of fish oil should we recommend that Western people drink? Not should we do it. They have to get a little bit off the subject. How much should we recommend that they now add to their diet? And they discuss it and they batter it about, and a few insults pass from some of the more illustrious members, and they finally decide, well, X amount of millimeters per day. And they decide, well, let's hammer it out. We'll compromise X.2 millimeters per day of fish oil. Yes, that's it. Very good. And so the committee issues its report, and 6 months later, you go into a drugstore and you think, oh, I was going to get healthier. Do you have any fish oil? And they go, fish oil? Boy, you behind the time. Nobody takes fish oil now, and there'll be something else. You remember the one that Life had local reality? Once it had pointed out, Life told local reality, let there not be enough thinking energy to go around. But then it said, but let there be fads and fashions to compensate. Hobbies. Ordinary life. Well, I guess I won't stay and rip that one to pieces, but that is right at the heart, both of those, of a kind of unseen, seamless, indescribable overlapping of what a real thinker's world, that is, being able to think about what's going on, not some of these ideas of that you're falling in some kind of mystical state, and by God, where the rest of people see it, the rest of the world sees mud and slime and evil. I dream of another world. To a thinker, if he was going to say something, it's like, screw another world, right here. Here's the fascination. The rest of it is mutual exclusive. If you're going to think about that, you can't think. It's right here. Not out there, of course, here. Because if you look out there, you think, well, if I had better technology, if I had more education, I could see that we're not the center of the universe. You mean after only 6,000 years of following your line of genetics, you're prepared? Yes, almost. If I had had a few more years in post-graduate work in philosophy, I believe that I might be ready to accept that. Is this a major breakthrough or what? What? That and the last part, if I didn't make the last example, if I didn't make that clear enough, the connection can't even be seen. It's not even considered. that if you tried to point out that, all right, if these people, if it's correct, that this one neighborhood of Laplanders can eat raw blubber to such a point that if the people investigating, these fine, upstanding, medical, jogging, biologists, doctors from Harvard, if they ate that much blubber, they'd be dead within 6 months. Their heart would be the size of a Henry J. of a spare tire. If that be true, and that then they narrow it down, the only thing that they can, and they can prove it statistically, they can prove it clinically, scientifically, that it is their high consumption of fish oil that then saves them from this blubber killing them. Therefore, we will start. We'll do it first, and we'll recommend it to all of our friends. We'll issue a report that we should drink fish oil, and it's going to do nothing. Well, it will not do what they said, what they observed it will do, and assume I'm correct. And they never, think about it, never collectively. Now, I don't mean there's not some individuals around that know this, if it was pointed out to them. But collectively, they never think, wait a minute, the only reason the fish oil works is because of the blubber. See, the point is, at the collective level, that can't be. Because if that is true, then collectively, suddenly man would go, wait a minute, this is a friggin' merry-go-round. We just keep adding new horses, and it looks better, we think it's faster, but they would go, whoa, and it would be destructive. They can't see it, and yet it's obvious as hell. Well, it's obvious as hell once you see it. And it explains why nothing is ever stable. And it explains why, if you just suddenly started paying attention and you thought, wait a minute, I just heard on the news tonight that they say your cholesterol level should be such and such. And you think, am I losing my mind? Or didn't I hear on the news like 6 or 8 months ago it was like twice that? Or, you should have lower or higher? Nothing's, it's just always changing. And ordinary people can become social critics on that basis. It's because they do not know how to think in a nonpartisan way. All right, I'll try to. I already did that one from memory. Well, I'll read a part of this. I'm not going to comment. It's a guy that, after he observed part of what had been going on in life, he came up with his own personal secret slogan. We are what we are, and there's nothing more to it. We are what we are, but for me, I just won't do it. The original inspiration for the concept of, quote, not having anything to lose came from the first men who took the full measure of their natural intellectual abilities. Historical myths, the second part, make past men look better than they were for a very good reason. Well, look at Copernicus. I mean, the man, if you had ever had any kind of scientific leanings in the past, you might have at some time purchased a little cheap print, or maybe an expensive print, of some intellectual hero, Socrates, Copernicus. Had them on the wall. What kind of hero is that? No offense to Copernicus, he's probably a hell of a guy. But to point out, to pick out historically, which the collective's already done, and they're correct. They're not incorrect. But that you're going to sit here and you have a hero around. Buddha over here, Copernicus, Darwin, Freud. But you look, and here's a man, collectively, historically, is accepted that after only, more or less, recorded, verifiable history now in the Western world of what? 4,000 years. In only 3,500 years or so, this fine gentleman, this brilliant thinker, discovered that Earth, and therefore ergo man, was not the center of the universe. Is that a hero? If you think it is, then he is a fitting hero. You could sit there, and when people come into your room and say, who is that painting? Who is that print? And you go, oh, that's Copernicus, one of my intellectual. Oh, yeah, him. It makes you feel good by association, of course. Copernicus. A lot of people your age have on their wall, Jimi Hendrix poster or something. Copernicus. I guess that would be another news item if we hadn't already done it, is everyone gets the heroes, has the heroes they deserve. I am really taken by a man, after 3,500 years of human progress, the one guy that came up with the idea, the theory that man is not the center of the universe. I mean, that's the kind of guy. Put him on the wall. That was the second part here, if you lost the place. Historical myths make past men look better than they are for very good reason. Well, the merry-go-round would look real warped. You ever seen an LP, those of you old enough to remember before CDs, it's been left out in the sun, up in a window. It will not play. You'll run the turntable, you run your car, it's gone. That's what the merry-go-round of ordinary intellectual progress would be if this sort of information began to actually get out. And the little horses and the little children on there went, "Oh, things are not really going in quite the way we always thought." Don't blame me now. Come on, you're not supposed to believe any of this stuff. It's entertainment. The herd must always believe itself, not some stray. Is this coincidence? I've covered half of them already and didn't even mean to. Hey, I got your coincidence. A man with a philosophy to live by. That was in quotations. I wish we'd gotten to this one. A man with a, quote, philosophy to live by. Think about it. Because anybody at the ordinary level that can think, as they call it, has a philosophy to live by. Whether it be religious or it can be scientific. I assure you that Copernicus had a philosophy to live by. It was probably something, I'm not trying to put words in his mouth, but let him sue me. But it was probably something like, don't take anyone's word for it. Look for yourself, through here. A man with a, quote, philosophy to live by is not only wandering about in the dark, but is carrying around some dark with him. That's what a philosophy is to a thinker. It is. Because what the philosophy of life is based upon what? Some mutual exclusivity somewhere. If a man says, my philosophy of life is to be a Christian. I'm talking about with a capital C, or a little c, whichever it is. Or a Catholic with a capital. Or a Jew, a Muslim, a thinker, a philosopher. That's my philosophy. Then it is mutually exclusive to anything else that's not. And so he's carrying around, and they would say just the opposite, as they should, that my philosophy, at least you scoff at it, sir, my philosophy of life is like a beacon in the dark, in the confusion, in the torment, the waves, the batterings of life. My philosophy is like a guiding light that carries me along. I love it. I like this better, though, since we reported it. A man with a philosophy to live by is not only wandering about in the dark, but he carries some dark with him everywhere he goes. That's what a philosophy of life is. You want to see some dark overcome you? If you can look, we'll wait just a minute and get a pencil and paper and write this down. And then notice it's like somebody's got a great dimmer on all the lights. In here, of course, not. And it seemed like everything went down maybe a couple of watts. That's what a philosophy of life's about. It's, in certain circles, I don't know how to ever point out, it's known as cement life preservers. You can figure it out. Since men know that they cannot be responsible for what they think, that is, they cannot think in an independent way, they cannot think outside the collective. Since men know that they cannot be responsible for what they think, they're extremely pleased, quite agreeable to become followers and employees. A man, woman feel just a little nude, maybe swinging in the wind a little bit, kind of getting chilly. Find a herd. Yeah, but you might find a herd that'll mislead you. Well, I'll worry about that later. I'm going to find a damn herd. You got to get out of the cold. And I'm not talking about just the wind blowing up under the skirts and under your cow tail. It's here. What I need is a philosophy of life to live by. I need a safe harbor. All harbors have a certain degree of darkness. Cows and sheep, connected, here, the last one, will only bunch up, that is, get together collectively and follow someone if the someone is serious. Think about it, it says, next time you start to dream that you might be some kind of potentially great leader of men. The point being, if you become a great leader of men, who are you going to have following you? Yeah, I don't think about that, do you? You're going to have a bunch of cows and sheep. That's all. You're going to have a bunch of the world's cheapest employees because you didn't even have to pay them. That's who you'll be. No, I'm not going to think about that. I know. Of course, the other part is, the first part, I think we've hit this in passing once or twice. Cows and sheep only get together, bunch up, and follow someone if the someone is serious. Think about it. Can we think of any historical precedent, forget some of the obscure Zen offshoots, in case any of you are going to try to pull that out as an exception, because that's anecdotal. The great movements of life. Have there been any great religions, schools of philosophy headed by anyone who resembled Emmett Kelly Jr., the Marx Brothers, Curly? Of course, not that they shouldn't have, but too late now. One mind thought. I do so love the idea of education. I only wish it would work. I would hope that by now, after this 45 minutes of me talking, you understand that's not a slam on education. It's on the basis if somebody could actually think that way of mine. Is I always wanted to think, and I thought, boy, if I could save up and go to X university or go to school, I'd do it because I love the idea. As opposed to being out in a bad neighborhood where they're having drive-by shootings every 30 minutes. You look out at a college campus, everybody seems nice and civilized, and there's always a little artistic something going on almost every afternoon. People leave their dorm doors open. They're out walking their dogs and jogging around. They're all young, bright-faced, looking for the future. The guy thought, God, I love the idea if it just worked. In other words, if I could go there and get what it was I wanted, Jesus, I'd stay there forever. I'd be the world's oldest student. I would die. I'd be, 89 years old, still living in a frat house somewhere, and just enjoying every minute of it. I only wish it would work. I know, sir. Jesus. Well, we're running out, but here's another description of the difference between a thinker's world that would be non-mutually exclusive, is this. Among the simple you must be complex, whilst among the complex you must be simple. That's not just a silly play on words or to come up with some sort of a non sequitur and try and look intelligent like, boy, it really means something. Well, it does. Because what this infers, or what this refers to, is at the ordinary level, people who are being very simple about something, very dogmatic, very partisan. There's somebody says, well, there's no doubt about it. If you're not a Christian, when you die, you'll suffer forever. Amongst that, of course, you wouldn't be speaking about it, but if you could think amongst simple ideas, that kind of simplicity, which is simply one-sided, it is partisan, it is based on a form of mutual exclusivity, you would have to be complex. If you were going to give in notice, if it was something you heard for the first time, which you'd obviously would have heard that one, but the first time you're faced with an absolute dogmatic, unconditional statement that somebody says, and it caught your attention. If you just weren't doing anything else and you thought about it, you would, if you're going to get anywhere with it, it may only be good for 10 or 15 seconds, or a split second of thought, but for you to get anything out of it, if you're amongst the simple, you've got to be complex. Just because someone says, well, if you're not an X, then when you die, you'll suffer forever. Then it's not, you just say, well, that's not true. There's some reason that life makes people say that. For you just to, out of hand, they say it, to take an opposing view and go, well, that's not true. Or, if they said, if you're not a Christian, you'll die and go to hell. If you're not a Protestant, and you might go, well, I think Catholics can go to heaven too. That's nothing. That's not thinking. We're not talking about debating the propriety of religion, but you understand, if they're being simplistic, and you take an opposing view, you're as simplistic as they are in thought. So you're not going to get anywhere. You'd have to be more complex. Then the dash, the second part of the sentence was, while amongst the complex you must be simple. And I'm not using complex here now in some sense that a person willfully was doing it, but if it was people being so convoluted, people discussing that they started trying to define they started doing some kind of like space age amphetamine version of Dante's seven circles of heaven and hell or something. In other words, they come up with this philosophy of life, and it goes on and on about, well, the God said this, and then they went, well, if you're under 4'5" though, then you might be able to covet your neighbor's goat, but not his wife. And you're just taking notes. It just becomes so convoluted. Not long enough, maybe we won't die, or at least we won't have time to think about it. I'm just showing one possibility. So it's at whatever level, there is no easy way out. Verbally, which is how I started this tonight, that amongst the simple, you must be complex, while amongst the complex, you must be simple. Because unless you're doing it willfully, in either case, you're dealing with that which is mutually exclusive to something else, and it's not based upon anything that people understand. That you just can't follow along with it. If you do, you'll be part of the collective herd, local intelligence forever. And you'll always wish, damn, I wish education would work. Well, let it run. Update of a previously reported story. This was from last time. The machinery of thought is not made to, quote, roll backwards. And the original item, if I remember correctly, it said that in fact, the original one said the mechanics of thought are not made to roll backwards, and thus a few joyfully have nowhere to turn to. Now, I was close to what it was. This was an update from last time. The machinery of thought is not made to roll backwards, and thus we have a new definitive description of, quote, the ultimate no way out. This is another version of not thinking in a way that would be mutually exclusive. Because to be mutually exclusive, you've always got to be able to roll backwards. That's why for a long time I kept stealing that little notice from those signs in parking lots that say, attempt to go backwards will result in severe tire damage. That you can't go backwards like that. An ordinary man can go backwards though. Because you're going backwards as soon as somebody stands up and says, the only people that God will have any faith in after we die, that the gods will bless, will be Muslims. And then of course a large segment of the population is going to go, wait a minute, I think Jews will, as opposed to that. You're rolling backwards. That is, you're taking some collective view which is based on nothing, not on any understanding, and you're going, no, wait a minute. And you go in the other direction. It's no better, it's no worse. But you cannot roll. The machinery of thought, individual, is not made to roll backwards. If you roll backwards, at the very least, you are spinning your tires. You are killing time. You're arguing with a herd of cows. You're arguing with the print of Copernicus. You have selected your peers. Yes, my peers are as stupid as I am. No, I don't like the way you put that, sir. I am not quite that stupid, or else I couldn't say that. And see, then they're satisfied. They can wander off and talk to themselves. And if you are arguing, if you are debating, if you are even chewing on any idea from the collective, a fact, we're not talking about strange theories, the facts. The truth of Copernicus, the truth of Freud, the truth of right now, the truth of the benefits of fish oil. If you're dealing with that, pro or con, you're rolling backwards. You understand? And it doesn't matter what. The examples are of no consequence. If an ordinary person would listen to it, for me to say, for the example to say that if one man stands up and says the only people that will survive after death are Protestants, and you say, no, I believe Catholics. When I say roll backwards, I don't mean that one of them's better than the other. What I mean is if you're arguing with collective thought, you're going backwards. The machinery for an individual to think is not made to roll backwards. which is why history is such a wonderful lesson. Well, assuming that, there's no good cartoon show on TV, think about history. And if you don't have a book, just sit quietly until you can get to where you can hear that kind of humming going on down your genes, and it'll tell you all you need to know. You don't need any more technology. And you understand that it's noise. And if you go, wait a minute, there's some important ideas back in that noise, as you call it. Roll on. That is backwards. Because you're not going anywhere. Well, wait a minute. If I apply myself, especially the kind of, may I say so, iron trap mind that I have, I'll show these cows that they're wrong. Now there's something to strive for. That would be a life well spent. To be able to show up perhaps, make them a laughing stock. There's this bunch of cows over here that had this idea about, well, when you die, if you actually lived a good life, you may end up being a hairdresser in Dayton. I can't believe that people still think like that. And perhaps you can round up a group of followers, publish a magazine to disprove this. Perhaps finally just almost run them out of business. To make them a laughing stock. Now, who knows, maybe somebody somewhere later will put up next to Copernicus a nice print of you. The man who showed the folly of the cows that believe that just because you lived a good life, that the only reward you'd get is to become a hairdresser in Dayton. There was another news item tonight that I was about to paraphrase a bit or plagiarize myself. You notice no one thanks me for pointing out these real silly, to use these silly examples instead of stuff. Isn't that better than talking about actual religion or nationality or something that might get close to you, that you might talk about a bunch of cows that believe when you die, you go to Dayton and become a hairdresser. Right, yeah. It's more entertaining, isn't it? Plus it sounds like, well, there's more possibility. That is so obviously allegorical that God knows what it means. If you can think, you know exactly what the hell it means. What's that?